hope everybody had a fun 4th of July. I hope everybody just had so much fun doing things with their families. I know I did. I got to go to Bear Lake on Friday and had such a fun day yesterday. Had lots of family here. So I'm excited to get to the part 4, the last chapter of The Ordinary Princess. The ordinary princess was feeding the last of the cake crumbs to Peter Aurelius and watching the man of all work making a necklace out of acorn cups strung on a grass stem. The evening sunlight was throwing long shafts of gold between the mossy tree trunks of the forest, and all around them birds were singing in the green thickets. This has been quite the nicest day of my life, thought the ordinary princess. And she thought, too, that the nice young man was easily the nicest person she had ever met. It's because he is an ordinary sort of person, like me, she decided. And indeed, a more ordinary person than the man of all work you could not wish to see. His velvet doublet was stained with moss and rather torn where he had caught it on a branch while climbing an oak tree to pick acorns. His hair was ruffled and full of bits of bark, and he had a smudge on his nose. As he strung the acorn cups on the grass stem, he whistled softly to himself. Lavender's blue, rosemary's green. When I am king, you shall be queen. There, he said, finishing the necklace and dropping it into the ordinary princess's lap. Be careful of it or it'll break. Oh, it's simply lovely, said the ordinary princess, and I shall keep it forever and ever. I don't expect it will last that long, laughed the man of all work. He lay back against the green moss and the twisty tree roots and gazed happily at the crisscrossy pattern of branches over his head. They had had a beautiful afternoon. The ordinary princess had managed to get away early from the castle, and as soon as she came within sight of the 3 silver birches on the edge of the forest, she saw that the nice young man was waiting for her. He told her that he had been able to get the afternoon off without too much trouble, and that he had brought a basket full of cakes, sandwiches, and apples. He made friends at once with Mr. Pemberley and Peter Aurelius, and after hiding the basket under a wild rose bush at the foot of an old oak tree, they had gone off into the forest to explore. Later they had climbed trees and played at ninepins with fir cones and crab apples. The young man had also shown the ordinary princess how to lie flat in the bank of a stream with her arm in the water and flip the little slippery trout out from underneath the stones and onto the grass. Together they had caught 5, and though they had thrown them all back at once, they had both got very wet, moss-stained, and excited, and enjoyed themselves enormously. Mr. Pemberley had visited his friends among the treetops, and Peter Aurelius had hopped and pecked and flown around among the bushes. When tea time came around, they picnicked under the biggest oak tree they could find and laughed and talked together as if they'd known each other always. Kitchen maid, said the nice young man, suddenly flipping an acorn at the ordinary princess. What's your name? Amy, said the ordinary princess, catching the acorn neatly and handing it to Mr. Pemberley. Nice name. It suits you, said the nice young man, adding in tones of immense scorn. Persephone, indeed. Who? Said the ordinary princess, rather startled. Oh, the young man looked a little confused. I was just thinking, he said. What silly names some people have. Why, I should like to know, inquired the young man hotly. Can't more people have nice, sensible, pretty names like Amy? I suppose you mean the Princess Persephone, said the ordinary princess. I don't know why it is, but princesses always do seem to have rather fussy names. You couldn't imagine a princess called Amy, now could you? I don't see why not, said the nice young man. Perfectly good name for anyone. I know we haven't been properly introduced, but I shall call you Princess Amy. The ordinary princess smiled to herself. My friends call me Peregrine, said the nice young man. Well, I'm your friend, aren't I? Said the ordinary princess as she stood up and held her hand out to him. Of course, said Peregrine, the man of all work, jumping up and taking it. So they shook hands and laughed at each other. Peter Aurelius and Mr. Pemberthy, said the ordinary princess, permit me to introduce you to a friend of mine, Peregrine. Quack, said the Peter Aurelius politely. Princess Amy, said the man of all work, allow me to present a friend of mine, Prince Peregrine. I am honored, sir, said the ordinary princess, sweeping into an elegant court curtsy. You said that just like a real princess, laughed Peregrine. The ordinary princess straightened up from her curtsy rather hurriedly, and said that it was high time they started back to the castle. Look, she said, you can see the evening star already. And sure enough, the sun had gone down, and between the tree trunks of the forest they could see the evening star twinkling in the apricot-colored sky among the distant rooftops of the city. We shall have to hurry, said the ordinary princess, or we shall be dreadfully late and get locked out when they close the castle gates at sundown. Besides, I'm on duty after dinner. So they ran back to amber in the twilight and arrived at the back gate that leads to the kitchen quarters, quite breathless and very dusty. May I come and picnic with you, with Mr. Pemberthy and Peter Aurelius, in 2 weeks, if I can manage to get off again? Oh, do, said the ordinary princess. Then I'll meet you at the 3 silver birches again, and I don't know when I've enjoyed myself so much before. Good night, Princess Amy. Good night, Prince Peregrine, said the ordinary princess, and she smiled as she slipped through the back gate and vanished into the kitchen. After that, the hardest or messiest work never seemed quite so hard or so messy to the ordinary princess. The days seemed to fly past, and she would sing to herself as she scoured pots and pans, peeled potatoes, or washed dishes. Lavender's blue, rosemary's green, when you are king, I shall be queen. She sang it so gaily that even the grumpiest cook had to smile. Every second Thursday she would fetch Mr. Pemberthy and Peter Aurelius, and they would all go off to meet Peregrine by 3 silver birch trees at the edge of the forest. They spent the most delightful afternoons exploring and paddling in the pools and streams. Peregrine made her a bow and arrow out of willow stems and taught her how to shoot a circle that they cut with his penknife in the bark of an oak tree. One day he brought a large bundle under one arm, as well as the picnic basket. What's that? Asked Amy. Wait and see, said Peregrine. When they reached their favorite oak tree, he opened up a little bundle. Inside was an axe, a little saw, a box of long nails, a hammer, and some rope. I thought it would be fun to build ourselves a little house to picnic in when the winter comes, said Peregrine. The ordinary princess clapped her hands with joy. Oh, you do have the nicest ideas of anyone I know, she said. Now where shall we build it? In the end, they chose a lovely spot in the tiny open glade in the forest. 2 silver birch trees grew in the middle of it, and a little spring bubbled out of the moss close by. They cut stout branches of oak, beech, and fir, and sawed them into proper lengths, and hammered them deep into the earth to make the walls. Across, they nailed other pieces of wood and made a roof out of willow branches, pine boughs, and ferns. They worked tremendously hard and got very hot, breathless, and happy. It took several second Thursdays before it was finished, but at last it was done. They carpeted the floor of the little house with the brightest green moss they could find, and cut more squares of moss to thatch the roof. The house had 2 windows and doors that opened and shut. And though the windows did not have glass in them and the door did not lock, they did not worry at all. They were extremely proud of their work. What shall we call it? Said the ordinary princess. Don't let's call it anything palacey or castle-ish. Let's just give it a nice, ordinary sort of name. Let's call it the Birches, said Peregrine. That's ordinary enough, and besides, there are 2 silver birches right beside the door. So the Birches it became, and the next time they came to the forest, Peregrine brought a bottle of ginger ale with him, and the ordinary princess smashed the bottle over the door exactly as she had seen her royal mamma smash bottles of champagne over the prows of her royal papa's new ships, and said, I name you the birches. The ginger ale trickled down the door and soaked into the moss, and Peter Aurelius tried to drink it. Autumn had come again, and in the forest the leaves were turning red and amber and gold, and the thickets were full of blackberries, hazelnuts, rosehips, and thorn apples. But at the castle, Queen Hedwig and her daughter Princess Persephone still stayed and stayed. It did not look as though they were ever going to leave. I do wish to goodness they'd go, or that the king would make up his mind and marry her, or something, said the ordinary princess one day to Peregrine. Why? Asked Peregrine, his mouth rather full of blackberries. Because having so many visitors makes an awful lot of extra work for kitchen maids, sighed the ordinary princess. You wouldn't believe how much, and Ethelinda says that Queen Hedwig won't go until she's managed to marry her daughter to King Algernon. Perhaps he doesn't want to marry her, said Peregrine, taking another mouthful of blackberries. Well, she's awfully pretty, said the ordinary princess. I saw her once. Haven't you ever seen her up close? Oh, once or twice, said Peregrine. Well, what's she like? Like a princess, said Peregrine. The ordinary princess threw a very squashy blackberry at him and hit him on the nose. That's a silly answer, she said. No, it isn't, said Peregrine, wiping blackberry juice out of his eye. I've worked at the castle for quite a long time, and if you've seen as many princesses as I do, you know what I mean. They're almost alike as peas in a pod. The ordinary princess smiled, a little secret smile to herself. Tell me about princesses, Peri. Well, first of all, they are very beautiful, said Peregrine, leaning back against a tree trunk. Here's a picture. That's Peri sitting in the forest, leaning against the tree trunk and licking off the points on his fingers. Then secondly and thirdly and fourthly, they all have long golden hair and blue eyes and the most lovely complexions. Fifthly and sixthly, they are graceful and accomplished. And seventhly, they have names like Persephone and Sapphire and Roxanne. And lastly, said Peregrine, running out of fingers, they are all excessively proper and extremely dull, except when they are make-believe princesses who are really kitchen maids. That's just what I've always thought about princes, said the ordinary princess. All of them? Asked Peregrine. All except make-believe ones who are really men of all work. Then they both laughed and went back to the castle hand in hand. Now, just about this time, it happened that the ordinary princess's old nurse Marta came to the city of Amber on a visit to her sister's niece, who had married a merchant of Ambergelder. Nurse Marta's sister's niece had a very large and jolly family of children who loved to go to picnics, and Nurse Marta's sister's niece's husband was particularly fond of blackberry and apple pie. So one late autumn day, when there was beginning to be a little nip in the air, Nurse Marta and her sister's niece and her sister's niece's husband and all the 8 children were picnicking in the forest to collect blackberries. Now Nurse Marta was rather stout and short of breath, so instead of rambling through the forest with the others, she sat herself down on a nice, comfortable clump of grass with her back to a tree trunk. In spite of the time of the year, the sun was very warm that day, and there was not a breeze stirring in the forest. Nurse Marta dozed, and so it happened that the ordinary princess came running around the tree trunk, tripped over Nurse Marta's feet, and fell right into her lap. "Help!" cried Nurse Marta, waking up very suddenly. "Oh, I'm very sorry," apologized the ordinary princess, picking herself up. "I didn't know that anyone was—" She stopped rather quickly. "Why, Marta!" gasped the ordinary princess. Oh, mercy me! Oh, your highness!" gasped Nurse Marta. "Oh, your highness! Oh, do hush, please!" begged the ordinary princess. But it was too late. "What's all this about highness?" asked Peregrine, who had been running after her. They had been playing tag. "Nothing," said the ordinary princess hurriedly. "Nothing at all. I think this old woman has made a mistake," and she frowned very hard at Nurse Marta. But the old nurse was far too excited to upset and take any notice of mere frowns. "Oh, your highness, wherever have you been?" she cried, and she caught the ordinary princess up in her arms and kissed her and hugged her and cried over her. "Oh, we thought you were lost. Oh, Princess Amy, how could you, my love? Oh, your dress, it's got holes in it and no shoes. Oh, you'll catch your death. Oh, what would your royal mamma say if she could see you now?" She went on, and the ordinary princess could do nothing to stop her until she had at last ran out of breath and sat down very heavily among the tree roots and wrung her hands. By which time, of course, it was far too late to pretend any more, and the ordinary princess patted Nurse Marta's plump shoulder and said she was quite all right, and that if Nurse Marta would write down her address, she would come and see her and explain everything. So when Nurse Marta stopped pouting, she gave the ordinary princess her address, and having promised faithfully not to breathe a word of the affair to anyone, she curtsied several times in an agitated sort of way and went off between the tree trunks, still wringing her hands. After she had gone, there was a long silence. The ordinary princess was looking rather ashamed of herself, and Peregrine was frowning. Presently he said, frowning more than ever, "So, you were a real princess all the time. Amy, you are a little fibber. And for 2 pins, said Peregrine, "I'd give you a good hard spanking." The ordinary princess stopped looking ashamed of herself and giggled instead. "You can't spank a royal highness," she said. "Can't I?" said Peregrine, looking quite as if he could. But the ordinary princess tugged at his little velvet sleeve with her little blackberry-stained hand, and said, "But it's not my fault, Perry. I can't help being a princess, and anyway, it doesn't make any difference, does it?" she added anxiously. "No," said Peregrine, and smiled his nice smile. "It makes no difference to me. But what about you? You're a royal highness, and I'm only a man of all work. Now, what does that matter? I should like you every minute as much as if you turned out to be a coal heaver," said the ordinary princess hotly. "So there." "I'll remember that when I'm a coal heaver," promised Peregrine. "And now you suppose you sit down and tell me how it is that a princess came to be a kitchen maid." So they both sat down on the moss and fallen leaves, and the ordinary princess told him all about everything right from the very beginning. And he laughed such a lot that they quite forgot the time and had to run back all the way to the castle for fear of being locked out when the gates were shut. "Good night, Prince Peregrine," said the ordinary princess, slipping into the back door. "Good night, kitchen maid," called Peregrine. "Quack," said Peter Aurelius. Mr. Pemberthy said nothing at all because he was sound asleep already, curled in a little furry ball in the ordinary princess's apron pocket. He continued to sleep so soundly that she hadn't the heart to disturb him, so she hung up her apron on a hook in her cupboard and went down to help with the dishwashing without it. There appeared to be more dishwashing to be done that night than ever. The piles of greasy dishes seemed as if they reached the ceiling. The ordinary princess broke 3 dinner plates and was severely scolded by the 4th assistant senior cook, whose temper was never very good. "You have to pay attention to what you're doing, washing dishes." Oh, but with the slipperiness of the wet plates, the ordinary princess did not have her mind on plates. She was wondering whatever she was going to say to Nurse Marta. "Oh, dear," said the ordinary princess. "Why did she have to come and spoil it all?" She sighed heavily and dropped a soup plate. It had broken into 18 quite small pieces, and one of those flew up and caught the 4th assistant senior cook on the nose. As we already know, his temper was not the best, and with so much extra work on account of Queen Hedwig of Plum-Blossomburg and her daughter and all the attendants staying on, and a bad attack of toothache that had keeping him awake for the past 3 nights. Well, that was the end of it, and the ordinary princess found herself dismissed. The 4th assistant senior cook did not put it as elegant as that. "You're fired!" shouted the 4th assistant senior cook. "Take a week's wages!" And with that he had ordered her out of the kitchen. "I don't care," said the ordinary princess, climbing wearily up the 4th flight of stairs on her way to the attic. "I don't care one bit." And a large tear rolled down her cheek and dripped off the point of her chin. "Oh, dear," sobbed the ordinary princess, sitting down suddenly on a step. "Whatever am I going to do now?" Someone was whistling somewhere. "Lavenders bloom gooseberries green. "Hi," called Perry in a loud whisper, appearing unexpectedly at the bottom of the staircase. "I've been waiting to catch you. There's something that I wanted to say." But the ordinary princess went on sitting on the stairs while her tears splashed on her shabby dress. Peregrine came up the stairs 4 steps at a time. "I say," he said, "what's happened?" I've been fired," sobbed the ordinary princess. "You've been what?" Dismissed," wailed the ordinary princess. "I broke 4 plates and cook fired me." "Good," said the peregrine approvingly. "How can you say that?" flared the ordinary princess. She stamped her foot and suddenly stopped crying. "How can you be so horrid when you know quite well that I haven't saved nearly 100 pfennigs, and I don't know where I'm going to get another job?" "Darling Amy," said Peregrine, "don't cry. I only said good because I think it's awful you're having to work so hard. You shall have all the pfennigs you want and all the dresses in the world." He lent her his pocket handkerchief, and Amy mopped her eyes and blew her freckled nose and sniffed. "I'd have given you 100 pfennigs weeks ago," said Peregrine, "only I was afraid that if I did, you'd just buy a new dress and run off to live in the forest, and I should never see you again." He smiled his nicest smile at her, and the ordinary princess could not help smiling back. Suddenly she felt much better. "You see," began Peregrine, but just at that moment, a door at the landing below opened, and through it came a very gorgeous person indeed. He wore a suit of crimson and violet taffeta, all laced with gold and embroidered with twinkling jewels, and wherever there was a room for one, he seemed to have added a bunch of ribbons. The toes of his purple velvet shoes were quite half a yard long, and he carried a tall golden stick. "Oh, now we'll catch it," thought the ordinary princess, for she was quite sure that tearful kitchen maids and sympathetic man-of-all-works were not supposed to sit about on staircases and gossip, even on back staircases. The very gorgeous person quite stood still and stared at them. His face got redder and redder until it was almost purple, and his eyes seemed as though they would pop out of his head in horror and amazement. "Oh, my goodness," thought the ordinary princess frantically. "Now Perry will get into hot water too, and I shall be fired all over again." But it seemed that the very gorgeous person was not going to fire anyone, for quite suddenly he stopped staring, and getting purple, he bowed very low instead. Your Majesty must excuse me," said the very gorgeous person, bowing again, this time even lower than before. "But I was to request your Majesty's presence in the council chamber. One of your Majesty's guards has informed me that you have been seen coming this way, and I could not believe—" Here the very gorgeous person broke off and gave an apologetic sort of cough, bowed again, and said humbly, "I trust that I do not intrude, but the Prime Minister begs me to remind you that the matter is urgent." And with a very shocked look at the ordinary princess, who really was looking like a very ordinary kitchen maid, he bowed himself backward to the door. "Well," said the ordinary princess. "Of course this would happen," said Peregrine. "Well, I must say," said the ordinary princess without stating it, and she rose and started up the stairs in a very stately manner. Peregrine put out a hand and caught the hem of her skirt. Since it is almost impossible to continue walking up a staircase in a stately manner while someone's holding on to your dress, the ordinary princess stopped and said very haughtily indeed, "Will your Majesty be so good as to release me?" "Don't show off," said Peregrine. "I can talk just like that too if I want to. And I was going to tell you, I really was. That's what I waited for. Only of course that flat-footed fathead of a court chamberlain had to go and spoil it all." "So you were a real prince, a king, all this time," said the ordinary princess. "Yes," said the king. "I'm afraid I was." "For 2 pins," said the ordinary princess severely, "I'd give you a good hard slap." The king grinned at her cheerfully. "You can't slap a king." "Oh, can't I?" said the ordinary princess, quite as if she could. Then they both laughed so much they had to sit down on the stairs again. Why did you tell me that your name was Peregrine? Asked the ordinary princess. Well, you must admit Algernon is pretty awful. Besides, Peregrine, my name is Peregrine. At least it's one of them. I've got 8 altogether. And between you and me, said the king, the other 6 are pretty awful too. Oh, I've got 7, said the ordinary princess, and some of them are simply terrible. And at that they laughed so much that they had to hold on to each other to keep from slipping off their step. Oh, this is dreadful of us, said the ordinary princess, drying her smudged face with the edge of her shabby skirt. We can't go on just sitting here and laughing. Someone will catch us. And besides, prime ministers and councils don't like to be kept waiting. Oh, let him wait, said the king cheerfully. But the ordinary princess got up from her step and dusted her frock. You may be a king, she said, but king are men of all work too. I was trying to forget that, said the king. Good night, man of all work, said the ordinary princess. Good night, kitchen maid, said the king. So the ordinary princess ran up to her bed in the attic, and the king went off to his royal council chamber. The counselors were yawning and fidgeting because they'd been waiting for quite a long time for the king, and anyway they hated night sessions. It made bedtime so late. But as the Lord Chamberlain had said, the matter under discussion was quite an urgent one, and when the king arrived, they all stopped yawning and looked rather severe, though their bows were as low and as correct as ever. Gentlemen, said the king, sitting down on his gilded throne at the end of one of the council chambers, you may be seated. There was a rustle of robes as the counselor sat down again. And now, said the king, what's the trouble? The trouble, it seemed, was the question of the king's marriage. The prime minister had called a council of state to urge his majesty to ask for the hand of her royal highness, the Princess Persephone of Plumblossenburg. And now, in speeches that lasted fully an hour and a half, the prime minister, the chancellor, the secretary of state for foreign affairs, had pointed out the advantages of the match. What a good thing it would be for the kingdom to have such a queen. What an excellent thing it would be for the country to have such a rich and powerful ally as Plumblossenburg. How greatly it would encourage trade, and how beautiful and graceful and charming and cultivated was the Princess Persephone. Some of the elder counselors frankly dozed, and the king played tic-tac-toe with himself on a bit of blotting paper. He tried to interrupt once or twice, but the prime minister and the chancellor and the secretary of state for foreign affairs all had good loud voices, and they were absolutely determined to finish their speeches, but gave it up and went on playing. So he gave it up and went on playing tic-tac-toe and tried not to yawn. The fact of the matter was, the entire council had got so used to managing affairs while he was a little boy that they sometimes forgot that he was no longer a little boy and quite capable of thinking for himself. But by now they'd all told him what to do and how to do it for so long that everybody had become used to it. So the king continued to play tic-tac-toe until there was no room on the blotting paper, as the prime minister and the chancellor and the secretary of state for foreign affairs had run out of things to say. When they had quite finished, the king tore up his piece of blotting paper and stood up. Gentlemen, said the king, I have listened with the deepest interest to all you have to say, which is really far from true, but royalty has to tell this kind of fib sometimes. And may I say, said the king, that I am deeply touched for your concern for my welfare. Royalty has to talk like that sometimes too. But, said the king, suddenly ceasing to be quite so royal, I'm dashed if I'll propose to cousin Persephone. Your Majesty, gasped the prime minister, the chancellor, the secretary of state for foreign affairs, and all the counselors at once. Don't interrupt me, said the king. I have listened to all your speeches, and now you can jolly listen to one of mine. I am going, said the king, to marry her serene and royal highness, the Princess Amethyst of Phantasmagoria, with or without your permission. So there. But, your Majesty, I haven't finished yet, said the king severely. I desire an embassy to set out for Phantasmagoria immediately to ask King Hildebrand for his daughter's hand in marriage, and the sooner the better. That is all I wanted to say. With which he bowed politely to the assembled counselors and marched off to bed. Phantasmagoria, said the prime minister. It is an idea, mused the Chancellor. Well, really, said the learned counselors. Whatever will Queen Hedwig say, groaned the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. I say, said the king, reappearing rather suddenly around the door. I forgot to mention that I think one of you should drop a hint to Her Majesty my aunt that even the most friendly of visits ought to end sometime. She and my cousin and all the ragtag and bobtail they brought with them have been here for weeks and weeks, said the king severely, and it makes a lot of extra work for the kitchen maids. And with that he disappeared around the door again, leaving the council gasping with dismay. The Prime Minister was the first to recover. You know, said the Prime Minister, that idea about one of the kings, about an alliance with Phantasmaria, isn't a bad one. I don't know why we didn't think of it before. It is every bit as powerful as Plumblossenburg, which we have already connected, Queen Hedwig being the Queen Aunt. And come to think of it, said the Prime Minister thoughtfully, she is undoubtedly a very bossy sort of woman, and if our king had married her daughter, she would have probably been an almost permanent visitor in the castle. Yes, said the Prime Minister, it is obviously for the best. Chancellor, kindly see about drawing up a draft for the hint that His Majesty requested, and the rest of you better start thinking about the embassy to King Hildebrand. The next morning, when the ordinary princess woke up, she found a note that had been pushed under her door. Meet me at the summer house by the lily pond as soon as possible. Urgent. P. So soon as she was dressed, the ordinary princess ran down the stairs and let herself out by the side door of the castle. She went round by the kitchen gardens, past the greenhouses and the cold frames, and came through a back way into the castle gardens by the royal lily ponds. It was a cold morning, and there was frost on the castle lawns and a thin, glittering rim of ice round the edge of the lily ponds, and though it was early, someone was earlier still. Inside the summer house, someone was whistling Lavender's Blue. Oh, I thought you were never coming, said the king. It's a dreadfully cold morning, so I brought a warm cloak for you. I came as soon as I could, said Amy, snuggling gratefully into the cozy folds of the fur-lined velvet cloak. Now look here, said the king, I haven't had much time, and I'm supposed to be having breakfast with my Aunt Hedwig, and afterwards there's going to be so much state business to attend to this morning that this is the only time I can get off, so pay strict attention to what I'm going to say. All right, said the ordinary princess, I'm listening. Well, first of all, said the king, will you marry me? There's a picture. Perry, gasped the ordinary princess. Yes or no? Demanded Peregrine. Oh, Perry, what a way to propose. There isn't time for a proper one, said Peregrine. I have to be with Aunt Hedwig at 8 o'clock sharp, and this is going to be a particularly annoying day for her, and I don't want to make matters worse by keeping her waiting for her breakfast. But marrying a king is a very serious business, don't you know, said the ordinary princess, pointed out. Don't you think I ought to have a little time to consider it? No, said Peregrine. You told me that yourself that you'd like me just as much if I turned out to be a coal heaver, remember? But you didn't turn out to be a coal heaver, did you? That's not the point, said Peregrine. What I want is a plain yes or no. Then are you sure you don't mind freckles and turned-up noses and mouse-colored hair? I love them, said Peregrine. Yes or no? Yes, said the ordinary princess promptly. Oh, darling kitchen maid, said Peregrine, catching her in his arms and kissing her. I knew you wouldn't desert me. Then, that's all right. And now to business. You can't go on being a kitchen maid, and anyway you've been fired, so you can't go on staying here. Why ever not? Asked the ordinary princess. Well, first of all, because I'm sending an embassy to ask for your father for your hand all properly, and it would be a bit awkward for everyone if you weren't there. Secondly, we can't go letting the populace find out that their future queen was once an assistant kitchen maid at the castle, because populaces are awful snobs, you know, and I don't think they would ever recover from the shock. I expect you're right, agreed the ordinary princess. I shall have to go back. I'll come for you just as soon as I can, promised Peregrine. But that won't be for months, said the ordinary princess more forlornly than ever. You know what ages they take arranging things and fussing over royal weddings. I know, said Peregrine gloomily. But I'll tell the embassy to hurry things up as much as possible. In the meantime, I think you better go off at once to Nurse Marta's, and I'll come there early as ever as I can tomorrow morning to take you home. We can ride through the forest, and no one will ever know." "All right," said the ordered princess. "There's the 7:45 bell. You'll have to run. Goodbye, Perry darling, and don't let your Aunt Hedwig bully you too much." She watched the king's long legs disappearing around the clipped yew edges and sighed. "Oh, he's a dear," thought the ordered princess, "and I suppose I'm glad that he is a king and everything's going to end happily ever after. But I still think that I shall always be a little bit sorry that I wasn't a real kitchen maid and he wasn't a real man of all work. It has been such fun," sighed the ordered princess, and she wrapped the splendid cloak more closely around her and went back to the attic to fetch Mr. Pemberley and Peter Aurelius before leaving the castle by the tradesman Interest to go in search of Nurse Marta. Very early the next morning, before the sun was up, Peregrine came to Nurse Marta's sister's niece's house to fetch the ordinary princess. Nurse Marta's sister's niece had lent her a clean dress and an apron and a pair of buckled shoes, and she wrapped herself in the fur-lined cloak that Peregrine had given her. "Goodbye," said the ordinary princess, kissing Nurse Marta. "Hurry up and come back soon, and don't ever breathe a word about this, will you?" She tucked Mr. Pemberley in her apron pocket, and Peter Aurelius perched on her shoulder. "What's that?" asked Peregrine as he helped her into the saddle and saw that she was carrying a bundle under one arm. "It's Clarinda's dress and my old cloak, and the cardboard box with my wages in it. I couldn't bear to part with them," said the ordinary princess. Mr. Pemberley scrambled out of her pocket and sat on the back of her saddle, and Nurse Marta waved her handkerchief to them from a window as they rode off down the cobbled streets of Amber to the forest and away to Phantasmagoria. There is a short cut through the forest far away to the city of Fanf and Phantasmagoria, and though the travelers by the high roads take at least 3 days to get from one kingdom to another, by riding all day through the forest, Peregrine and Amy came to the castle of Fanf by moonlight. They halted their horses at the edge of the trees, and Peregrine helped the ordinary princess to dismount. She was a little stiff from riding so much and was cold and depressed. "I wish I was going back with you," said the ordinary princess, holding very tightly to Peregrine's hand. "So do I," said Peregrine, "but let's not think of that. Let's think about what fun it's going to be when I come and fetch you." He went with her to the foot of the turret wall, where the trysty stem that was straight was just as twisty and knobbly as ever. "You'll have to throw me my bundle when I'm up," said the ordinary princess. "Goodbye, my kitchen maid," said Peregrine. "Goodbye, my darling Amy. The months will simply fly by, and when the spring comes, I will come and fetch you away." "Goodbye, my man of all work," said the ordinary princess. "Oh, Perry, darling, you will take care of yourself, won't you? And don't let your Aunt Hedwig be horrible to you, and don't let them make them marry you off to any tired Persephones instead of me. And promise you won't forget me, and I hope that spring comes quickly, and I do hope that I can remember how to climb this thing," said the ordinary princess all in one breath. Then she and Mr. Pemberley climbed up their wisteria to her turret room, and Peter Aurelius slipped after them. "Catch!" called Peregrine, and he threw up the bundle which was Clorinda's ragged dress, the old cloak, and the cardboard box with the fittings in it. "Spring will be here in no time," called Perry, and he blew her a kiss. Then he mounted his horse, and leading the one way that the ordinary princess had ridden, turned away in the moonlight and set off into the forest. Well, you can imagine the sensation that was there the next morning when the Princess Amy calmly walked down to breakfast as though she had never been away at all. Her royal mamma, the queen, thought she was seeing a ghost and nearly fainted, and her royal papa, the king, said, "Bless my soul," so many times that it began to seem as though he would never stop. There's the king and queen. So happy to have her back. But when all the flurry and excitement had died down, they were simply so pleased to have her back that they quite forgot to give her the scolding she deserved, and in spite of the fact that she looked possibly more ordinary than ever. Certainly she was a great deal thinner, but she was taller too, so that the brocaded gown she put on did not fit her very well. "Oh, "Oh, my dearest child," explained the queen, throwing her hands up in horror. "Whatever have you been doing to yourself? I declare you have more freckles than ever. We must do something about them now," said the queen, bustling off to see about ordering some more extra lemons and lily lotion. "Bless my soul," said the king for what must have been the 50th time. "Well, you may look like a gypsy, Amy, but I'm exceedingly glad to see you back." "Darling daddy," said the ordinary princess, kissing the top of his bald head. "I'm glad too, but no more shutting me up in towers and hiring dragons, do you hear? No, no, not if you don't wish it. Not if you don't wish it, my dear." "Bless my soul," said the king. After the excitement of the first day, they all settled back comfortably into their own lives, and things went on just as before, so the ordinary princess almost began to feel as if she had never been away and must have dreamed it. Her mamma, the queen, tried as hard as ever to make her look like a real princess, and the Council of State, who never seemed to learn by experience, tried as hard as ever to find suitors for her hand. The Lord High Chamberlain, an enterprising man, remember it was he who had suggested the dragon, even went so far as to put the name of the Crown Prince Clarence of Kleptomania as a possible husband for the prince. But the suggestion was turned down owing to the unfortunate failing of the Kleptonian royal family for absent-mindedly pocketing any trifles that may be lying around. And as the king had said, the disgrace of having an unmarried princess in one's family was preferable to having a son-in-law for whose visits one had to lock away the gold plates and chain the spoons and forks to the table. "It is quite obvious to me," said the queen in a resigned voice, "that Amy will be an old maid. There has never been such a thing in our family before, but it seems we were to have one now." But the queen was wrong. For a week after the runaway princess had returned home, the queen came rushing into her room in a state of great excitement. In fact, she was so excited that it was some time before she could speak. "Oh, my child!" exclaimed the king wildly, embracing her youngest daughter. "My Amy!" She sat down heavily on the ordinary princess's golden bed, on top of the ordinary princess's second-best dress that had been laid out on the coverlet, and fanned herself with a lace handkerchief, while the ordinary princess's ladies-in-waitings and maids of honor stood around simply bursting with curiosity. "Oh, my child," said the queen again, getting her breath, "put on your nicest dress at once, and do, my dearest Amy, try to look your best. An envoy extraordinary has arrived from His Majesty the King of Ambergeld to request your hand in marriage. Oh, was there ever such an enchanting piece of news?" cried the queen, quite overwhelmed by this unexpected stroke of good fortune. The king and his whole council had been equally overcome. "Do you suppose, dear," the king said nervously, "that they'll change their minds when they see Amy?" "Leave it to me, dear," said the queen, and she gave orders that all the lights in the stateroom should be lowered and that only the very plainest ladies-in-waiting should be allowed to attend the ordinary princess. "That ought to help," said the queen hopefully. So when the ordinary princess was dressed in the most magnificent robes imaginable and hung with diamonds and amethysts and made to wear her very best occasion crown, and sent down to meet the envoy extraordinary and his attendants in the throne room, accompanied by the plainest ladies in the palace, which probably accounts for the fact that the very gorgeous person whom she had last seen standing at the foot of the back staircase in Amber Castle, and who was one of the envoy extraordinary's attendants, never recognized her at all, even though he had stared so hard and disapprovingly at the little kitchen maid who had been caught talking to the king. The whole reception passed off beautifully, and when it was arranged that the wedding should take place the last week in April, the queen almost wept with joy. As for the king, he said, "Bless my soul," 117 separate times, and raised the salaries of the entire palace staff. So the envoy extraordinary went back to Ambergelder, leaving the court of Phantasmarina quite dazed with excitement to prepare for the wedding of the 7th princess of the royal house of Fanfaria. But in spite of all the preparations and the ordering of a most magnificent trousseau, The ordinary princess thought the winter passed slower than any winter had ever done before. It seemed that spring would never come. Day after day she would sit at her window looking at the dark forest where the bare branches of the tree were covered with snow, and wondered if it would ever be green again or full of birds and butterflies and wildflowers. When she was not looking out the window, she was being fitted for a new dress, or sitting at a desk writing hundreds of thank you letters for all the wedding presents that kept arriving at the palace. Then she had to sit for her portrait, as the queen had ordered one from Mynheer van Turpentine, the court painter, to be sent to the King of Ambergelder, and nobody dreamed that he had ever seen her. Mynheer van Turpentine was instructed to flatter her as much as possible, which he did. "But it isn't the least bit like me," protested the ordinary princess. "Nonsense, dear," said the queen firmly. "It is you at your best, and though I would admit that it's not one would call a striking likeness, we cannot afford to take any risks. After all," said the queen comfortably, "by the time His Majesty sees you himself, it will be too late for him to change his mind." And with that she sailed off to see arrangements for displaying the wedding presents. The ordinary princess laughed and tried to imagine what Perry would say when he received the portrait. "Don't get worried," she wrote him. "I haven't really grown like that. My nose is still turned up, and I have as many freckles as ever." Peregrine wrote a very correct letter about the portrait to the queen, but to the ordinary princess he wrote, "I have hung the painting in one of my state drawing rooms that I hardly ever go into, and when I have to, I only think about how glad I am that you are not a bit like that, and your nose still turns up and has as many freckles as ever. Darling Amy, don't ever change." At last, the snow melted and the air became warmer. Birds began to sing in the forest afar away, and on the boughs of the tree tiny buds appeared, and presently the world grew green again. Early primroses spread gay golden carpets between the gray tree trunks, and it was spring once more. In the last week of April, King Algernon of Ambergelder, who was also Peregrine, the man of all work, came riding to the kingdom of Phantasmaria at the head of a glittering cavalcade of knights, barons, and fair ladies. And in the great throne room on the palace of Fanf, His Majesty King Hildebrand took his youngest daughter by the hand and led her forward to meet the King of Ambergelder. "My daughter Amethyst," said the King Hildebrand, a little flustered by the grandeur of the occasion. "Amy, this is Algernon." The ordinary princess tried very hard not to giggle as she swept the most magnificent curtsy. She was wearing a magnificent gown with a 10-foot train and really looked quite smothered in jewels. But the King of Ambergelder only saw among the glittering diamonds and ropes of gleaming pearls Her Serene and Royal Highness Princess Amethyst Alexandra Augusta Araminta Adelaide Aurelia Anne of Phantasmaria was wearing a little necklace made of acorn cups. His Majesty of Ambergelder replied to the princess's curtsy with the most courtly of bows. He was dressed every bit as magnificently as she was, and looked very kingly indeed. "Oh dear," thought the ordinary princess in a panic, "he doesn't look a bit like my Perry." Then the heralds blew a fanfare on their silver trumpets, and King Algernon winked at the princess. "Oh, Perry," whispered the ordinary princess under the cover of the fanfare. "It is you, after all." "Of course it's me," whispered Peregrine. "But do try to look as though we'd never just been introduced this minute." "I'll try," giggled the ordinary princess, "but I really do believe it's the hardest thing I've ever had to do." And there they are. And so the next day they were married in the great cathedral of Fanf by 20 archbishops with the most magnificent of ceremonies. The ordinary princess wore a wedding dress with a train that was 17 yards long and took 20 pages to carry it. Her 6 lovely sisters, with their husbands and children, all came to the wedding, and so did the fairy Crustacea, who arrived in a chariot entirely made of oyster shells and was drawn by 100 golden frogs. Her clothes were wetter and more seaweedy than ever, but she was in a remarkably good temper and stayed until quite late. "I haven't sent you a wedding present," she said as she kissed the bride, "because my presents aren't the kind that can be tied up with paper and string. But bend your head, my dear," said the old fairy Crustacea. Then she tapped the ordinary princess, who was now the Queen of Ambergelder, on the forehead with her long, twisty coral stick. "You shall always keep the love of your husband and the respect and devotion of your subjects," said the old fairy Crustacea. "You shall have 4 gallant sons and 2 darling daughters, and you shall live happily all your days." "Now that," said Peregrine, "is something like a wedding present." So Peregrine and his queen drove away from the palace in a crystal coach, and everyone threw rice and rose petals and satin slippers, and waved their hands and their handkerchiefs and cried good wishes. But nobody noticed that the new Queen of Ambergelder took with her a rather untidy brown paper parcel, or that perched among the carvings of the coachman box sat a little red squirrel and a glossy black crow. And of course everyone thought that the royal bride and groom would spend their honeymoon in one of the bridegroom's many castles. No one guessed that instead they spent it in a little log hut called the Birches on the far side of the forest afar away. For the little hut was still standing in spite of the winter storms and snow. The moss was greener than ever, and primroses, windflowers, and wild cherries brightened all the forest. The ordinary princess, who had once been an ordinary kitchen maid, and now was Queen Amethyst of Ambergelder, wore Clorinda's ragged dress, which she had carefully mended, and cooked the brown trout that Peregrine, who was always Peregrine, caught in the forest streams for their dinner. Mr. Pemberthy skipped among the branches, and Peter Aurelius cawed happily to himself from the roof of the Birches. "Lavender's blue," sang Peregrine, chopping firewood. "Rosemary's green. When I am king, you shall be queen." "And so I am," said the ordinary princess. The end. Girls, it was so fun to be with you and to read this story. Wish that we could be together, but I have faith that we'll be together soon. I love you all, and I hope you've had a fun week working on your camp bingo and doing some fun things. Hope you all had a wonderful holiday. Have a good night.